Welcome, everyone, to Catalista's 2 Minutes to Midnight. People get ready. My name is Henry Coleman, coming to you from the studios at Catalista Centrale. "2 Minutes to Midnight, People Get Ready," or 2M to M, is a deep dive into how the world works. In Season 1, we explore a book that connects the dots between accelerating computing power, capitalism, and democracy. It's called People Get Ready: The Fight Against a Jobless Economy and a Citizenless Democracy by Robert McChesney and John Nichols. And I'm happy to have both Bob and John right here with us on our first episode. We'll kick things off with the introduction to People Get Ready. Welcome to the future. But before we jump in, let me tell you a bit about the name of our podcast. 2 Minutes to Midnight refers to the doomsday clock. It was created in 1947 by a group of atomic scientists, including Albert Einstein. Midnight stands for nuclear annihilation, and the clock changes each year based on the scientists' evaluation of how close we are to self-destruction. In 1947, the clock was set to 7 minutes to midnight. Today, we're inside the 2-minute mark. Now let's counter that rather bleak prologue with two guests who are anything but pessimistic. Robert McChesney is a professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and the co-founder of the media reform organization Free Press. John Nichols is a national affairs correspondent at The Nation magazine and a prolific and widely published political writer. Both have written numerous books, and they collaborated on Dollarocracy, The Death and Life of American Journalism, Our Media, Not Theirs, and of course, People Get Ready. Bob and John, thanks for joining us for episode 1 of 2 Minutes to Midnight. Bob, can we start with you?
Sure.
The introduction is titled Welcome to the Future. So let's head into the future with a big overview. What is People Get Ready all about? What is a jobless economy? And what do you mean by a citizenless democracy?
Let's start at the top, really. The book was driven, I think, by our mutual concern about the extraordinary technological revolution that's going on, typified by the internet and digital technologies. We're really expanding every aspect of social life and redefining it, and trying to make sense of where we're going, how that's going to affect our societies, our economies, our democracies, our political systems, and what we can do about it, what we should be aware of that's going on. Because what John and I both saw was that behind the scenes, unknown to the public, there's a conversation going on among political leaders, business leaders, bankers, technology people, where they're talking about a future that most Americans have no idea that they're talking about, in which there's these revolutionary technologies that are to completely upend society. And it seemed to us that the title of the book came from the idea, but you ought to be aware of this. This is stuff you ought to know about, that you need to get on top of, and you've got to get involved with, because it's going to happen to you. The question is whether you're going to influence how it happens to you or not as an individual, and more importantly, collectively, citizens in a society, as a collective organization, what we as people are going to do in the coming era. And, I think in terms of the political economy, when I use that term, what we mean is the technology will reshape capitalism as we understand it, the economy. It will reshape our political system, and it's going to have a tremendous effect on them. But at the same time, our economy, capitalism, the firms that dominate it, the profit motive on one hand, and our political system is going to shape how these technologies develop. So it works on both sides. And so the argument of the book is that we've got to get very aware of this problem and understand we've got to get politically active if we want to have the type of world that's being created be one that suits the interests of the people and the planet, or one that suits the interests of the small number of people who are making all the decisions right now.
That's quite the call to action. So, John, People Get Ready. We were wondering, is the reference to the Curtis Mayfield song intentional? And if it is, how is it relevant to what's been happening since the book was published in 2016?
Well, it's very intentional. In fact, coming off what Bob just said, we were very conscious of the fact that there are conversations going on at Davos, at Aspen, wherever very wealthy, very powerful people meet to discuss what the future would look like, that the great mass of people weren't being invited into, that in fact they were being pretty much shunted aside from. And so we wanted to have a message that alerted folks. And we thought People Get Ready was a great way to come at it, in part because that's exactly what we want to tell folks. They need to get ready for these changes. Wealthy and powerful people are already not just ready, but they're implementing. They're making it work for them. But what's coming isn't being made to work for the great mass of people. And so it's that opening of things. But what Mayfield did in his song, the genius of the Curtis Mayfield song, is that it's a democratizing song. It says, everybody can get on board. It isn't just this notion that something's coming at you. It's that you can be a part of what the future looks like. And there's a wonderful line in the song, "Have pity on those whose chances grow thinner." And the idea being that there is a future coming. And unless we intervene now, chances will grow thinner for the great mass of people. Most people will have to work harder for less if they can find work at all. And their prospects will become much dimmer, much lessened by technological change. On the other hand, if people get on board, if they, become a part of this, and frankly, assert their right as human beings to shape the future, then it doesn't have to be getting ready for something that's necessarily bad. It could be getting ready for something that's actually very good. It's just that they have to define what it is, not those very wealthy and powerful people at Davos and Aspen.
So what you're saying is, this is kind of a make or break moment in history. And on that note, I'm curious as to how you relate this idea of the Cambrian Age to where we are today. Just for context, the Cambrian Age was a relatively brief geological age when there was this really rapid development of life on our planet, from single cells to animal life. Bob, you compare what's happening now to that Cambrian Age. Why the comparison?
Well, actually, I didn't make the comparison originally. We've put it in the book, but the comparison was made by the person who's the director of DARPA, which is the Pentagon-based research arm that funds high technology research. And he was in charge of the robotics program for over 10 years. And when he left DARPA in 2015, he wrote an article on sort of the extraordinary developments they're working on there in robotics and artificial intelligence. And he was the one that said, this is like the Cambrian Age. And that's the first time I really heard of the Cambrian Age. I had to look it up and study it. And it was relatively brief in geological terms, but it was, 15 or 20 million years. So in the big scheme of things, it lasted, a couple hundred times longer than our species has been on this planet. So by the scheme of a 3 billion year old planet, it was relatively brief. And you're right, what happened in the Cambrian Age was we went from being single cell organisms to complex organisms and things like, so everything we think of as life beyond single cells emerges really rapidly. It wasn't a slow, gradual thing. There was this revolutionary 10 or 15, 20 million year period. And vision begins, for example, something extraordinary that living creatures be able to see. That comes in, and everything like that in this one brief period that we were the result of today. And why he used that is to say that basically we're entering the Cambrian Age. The other side is going to be such a revolution, it's going to be beyond anything we can even imagine now. And I think that's the beauty of that term, is to say that we can sit around and speculate what it's going to look like, how long it's going to take, but we have no idea. It's a revolutionary moment. The one thing we know is there's going to be unbelievable change. And that's why we should be concerned. And we should say, okay, what sort of change do we want and what do we not want? What values do we want to encourage? What values do we want to protect? What things do we want to not have happen ideally with this technology? Because we do have the ability to control it. This is not something that's happening on high. This is something human beings are doing, and they're creating and discovering and making. And that's why I think he used that terminology, because he was trying to send this warning out, get serious. This is really happening. You have no idea what's coming. And I think that's why we wanted to frame it that way. And I think people are attracted to that because then it says you don't really have to know exactly what the world's going to look like 100 years from now or 50 years from now. You don't have to know exactly where the technology is going. No one knows. Even the smartest AI scientists in the world really don't know. They know more than we do, perhaps, but they don't know. We have a lot of power as humans, as social creatures, to shape the nature of where these technologies go, who they work for, to what end, what sort of world we're creating. We're the only species that's ever had this power. And some of us are going to use it. We argue all of us need to use it together in a cooperative manner to make sure we get a healthy response, not leave it to the handful of those with their own self-interest to make those decisions.
Yeah, I think it's so important what you're saying there, Bob, especially about looking at technological change through the lens of what we need to protect, not just what fancy new gadgets are we going to play with. To me, that's a sentiment that can actually help marry liberalism and conservatism in a powerful way. John, do you think it's possible for both liberals and conservatives to embrace the ideas in People Get Ready?
For people who disagree on so much to actually find some common concern. And I would say the answer is that yes, it is possible for people on the left and the right to understand these issues and ultimately to find some common ground. But it won't happen easily because power will seek to keep people divided, right? The last thing they want is for the great mass of human beings to recognize that they have more in common than what separates them and to start to say, look, we really need to step up and tell these billionaires, these soon-to-be trillionaires, that they don't get to call all the shots. They don't get to define everything. And the one thing that's interesting is that when you talk to someone who is genuinely on the left or genuinely on the right, the thing that does tend to concern them is that somebody with a lot of money who they've never met is, signing a check or pushing a button that is going to redefine their life. And so part of our mission, and Bob and I have done this throughout all of our writing over the years, is to try and speak beyond the narrow debates of the moment to the broader concerns of the great mass of people. And it's interesting that when we were writing this book, when we were doing a lot of our initial work on it, it was before Donald Trump had risen as a political force. He was certainly a prominent figure, but he wasn't running for the presidency when we were starting to work on this book. And Bob and I kept coming back to certain themes and chapters that we would send to our editor. And one of them was that if the people do not get engaged, if they don't step up in a fundamental way, then there is a really clear path toward a future in which you have very powerful, very authoritarian forces guiding our lives, essentially defining everything we can do, effectively a fascism. And our editor, when we would start, putting these chapters in, would say, well, I don't know, that's going a little far. That's a little extreme to talk about fascism and moving to a point where, people really do lose the power to define their own lives and define the future. And we said, look, that's where the research takes us. That's where, when we look at the information about where we're headed, about what's going to happen with jobs, what history tells us about what happens in these radical economic and social transformations, that this is a very dangerous moment and it's going to get more dangerous. And the interesting thing is that as Trump rose, we were, finishing the book and, doing more work on it. And as he became more and more prominent, more and more powerful, our editor started saying, wow, it turns out you're right about this fascism stuff. You're right about this authoritarianism. You're right about these concerns. And that was reassuring to us. But it went to the heart of the challenge. And that is that in moments like this, it is very easy, as everything gets upset, as every rule is rewritten, as the future of your work, the future of your family life, the future of how you communicate with other people, as it's all upended, right? People are going to look for answers. And in a moment like that, authoritarians will jump in and say, well, I've got a way to organize the future. Let me tell you what to do, right? Let me guide you through this moment. And that's happened in the past, and it certainly could happen now. And this conjunction of the authoritarian individual, the authoritarian leader, with big corporate power is something that, frankly, I think concerns both Bob and I a great deal. And so, to our view, what we wanted to do was to intervene and say, look, there's an alternative route. And that alternative route is to recognize the fight isn't between necessarily left and right. The fight is between up and down, between those who are in positions of great power and who would like to define the future very narrowly in their own interest, and the great mass of human beings who we want to bring into the process. And to sum it up, our view is there is the possibility of a new coalition, right? A coalition of the great overwhelming majority of people saying, we want to be at the table. We want to be a part of defining the future. And if that doesn't happen, if the future is defined for us by others, we know that it will be a lesser future for us and a greater future for them. So helping to have these understandings of what the fight is about, that's really at the heart of People Get Ready. It is to tell people that there's a great struggle coming, you'd better be ready, and you'd better recognize who you're fighting against. You're not fighting against your next door neighbor. You're not fighting against somebody who doesn't look like you. You're not fighting against somebody who comes from a different country. You're fighting against a handful of very powerful people who would like to define the future in their interest, but not in your interest.
I think it is time for us to get ready, stop fighting each other, and get clear on what's really worth rallying around. Bob, you make it clear that democracy is the best political system for our times. That includes how democracy shapes technology, economics, politics, the social realm. What is democracy, and why do you feel it's the best hope for a better future?
Well, I think oftentimes when people think about democracy, they think about it as like rules for elections and voting and government running things. And it's sort of a bureaucratic or administrative understanding of what a democracy is. And I think that is important stuff, but it misses the most important thing about democracy. Perhaps the best place to see what democracy looks like is look when a country becomes democratic for the first time or it first emerges. What happens? What changes? You can see what the really crucial ingredient is. And if you go to the first great Western democracy, the one that everyone points to, it's ancient Athens in Greece. And what had happened in Athens to produce the first democracies we know it? Well, it was the first time people without property were allowed to participate as equal citizens in decision making. Before that, in all undemocratic societies, people without property are cut out. It's purely class-based. Democracy is basically empowering people who are poor to have equal power with those who are rich to participate in social life and governing their lives. And that's what happened in Athens. And the battle was, once it was created, the democracy, was to keep it. And they only kept it for a century till finally the oligarchs and the wealthy of Athens were able to reinstitute barriers to prevent poor people from participating. But that's what it's always about. That's what's at stake here. All the other stuff is subterfuge, or it's just stuff to distract you. That's where you should keep your eye on that prize. And John and I study U.S. history a lot. We write about it all the time. We're passionate about it. And that's the recurring theme in American history from the very beginning. You see forces defining democracy differently, or if one side defining a democracy as not democracy, fake democracy, where only property owners participate and lots of people aren't allowed to participate. Women, slaves, poor people, they can't participate. That's their democracy. And then there's always been, from the very beginning, going back to the revolution, those who define democracy in a manner that's much more progressive, egalitarian, everyone participates. And this struggle has been going on in the United States and in other countries ever since. And that's the struggle that's going on today, in our view. What sort of democracy is going to be in name only, one where people don't vote, have no power, really have no idea what's going on, sort of a pseudo-phony democracy like we really have for the most part in the United States and most countries in the world today, or one where people actually are engaging, participating, organizing, creating policies, challenging power, exercising power. And this is understood that way. What are the benefits of democracy? Well, it's great because it's the foundation then for fairness, for justice, for opportunity. It makes the good society. It's not an accident that the 100 years that Greece was a democracy, considered like the most amazing 100 years in human history. This revolutionary motherlode of philosophy and art comes out of almost nowhere, it seems like, during that era. It's true in any great democratic period. That's what you get. And those who oppose democracy, it's really clear, going back to Greece throughout American history, it's always been about protecting property and privilege. Always, right to this present day, it's all about protecting property and privilege. And the sort of societies that are undemocratic or non-democratic or anti-democratic invariably are unfree societies. They're invariably societies that are dispirited with very low morale. And they're always societies that are rife with corruption because no one believes in anything except taking care of number one. And they always fail eventually. And so if we don't democratize our society, it's not, we talk about, well, the guys at top will win, but eventually the ship they're guiding is going to sink. We're dealing in a very treacherous period. We've got to get democracy so all of us get to the other side. No one's getting over there unless we all get there. To jump ahead to Martin Luther King's quote we'll be getting to later on, I suspect. So that's why John and I emphasize in the book and in all our writing, we're always concerned with technology and the internet. We're very concerned with journalism, but it's always because these are institutions that need to strengthen democratic participation and practices. That's the nucleus of the atom that makes everything go. And if you don't have that, nothing else matters. If you have that, anything's possible.
Let's talk about strengthening democracy in practice. John, there are two essentials in the book that we'd like to dive into. What is democratic infrastructure, and what is a democratic economy?
Well, those are indeed two of the core concepts of the book. And I think the best way to begin is to just give a quick answer to each and then to dig into it a little bit. Democratic infrastructure it's our entry point. It's the vehicles by which we can govern, right? That the great mass of people can define what happens so that the will of the people becomes the law of the land, that our interests are represented in the decision-making of a country, of those who maybe represent us, but indeed do have to represent us rather than simply go their own way or respond to power. So that's democratic infrastructure, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a second. Democratic economy is essentially the concept that we shouldn't just have the power to define who represents us in Washington. We should also have the power to define how our economy works. I mean, how our jobs work, how our workplaces operate. But beyond that, in a much deeper sense, whether we live in an economy where we are exploited or whether we live in an economic system where we can realize our potential and our promise as human beings. And the best way to kind of pull those two together is a quote from Franklin Roosevelt, the 32nd president of the United States, that he delivered in one of his last great speeches. It was a second to last State of the Union address, and it was a speech in which he described what he called a second Bill of Rights or an economic Bill of Rights. And I'll just read very quickly from it. It's not, the portion I'll look at is not long. Roosevelt said, "The Republic," this is speaking of the United States, "had its beginning and grew to its present strength under the protection of certain inalienable political rights, among them the right of free speech, free press, free worship, trial by jury, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. They were our rights to life and liberty. As our nation has grown in size and stature, however, as our industrial economy expanded, these political rights proved inadequate to assure us equality in the pursuit of happiness. We have come to a clear realization of the fact that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. Necessitous men are not free. People who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made. In our day, these economic truths have become accepted as self-evident. We have accepted, so to speak, a second Bill of Rights under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station, race, or creed." And so what Roosevelt was saying, this critical concept is that if you have a lot of political rights, right, you have the right to vote, you have the right to communicate your opinions, to advocate, to organize, to do all that. But there is an economic system that creates such a profound hierarchy that some people are dramatically more able to define that process, to define the results of that process, either by giving money to candidates, by lobbying, by buying a television network and just shouting louder than everybody else, by controlling the digital infrastructure where social media plays out. If a handful of people have that power and most other people don't, then you don't have an economic democracy. You have a situation where most people are struggling just to get by, struggling to get housing, struggling to feed themselves, struggling to find work if they can, versus people that are living in great comfort and obviously protect their comfort. So when we pull these two things together, our argument is that the moment we are in is one that is going to create a great deal more precarity, i.e., a lot of people are going to be in a situation where their economic freedom is incredibly limited because we've defined so much of our lives around jobs and the availability of jobs. If jobs become less available, or simply if they become redefined as sort of gigs that we have to rush to try and cobble enough of it together to make a living, then we're going to be focused on survival, right? And increasingly, that focus on survival in a radically changing society will make a lot of us desperate and a lot of us in a situation where we are exploited rather than empowered. And so that's why you have to talk about having that democratic infrastructure, those ways to communicate and to act and to define governance, along with an economic democracy that allows us all to participate at the freest level, at the fullest level. And a final thing about that relates so much to what Bob and I have written about throughout our many years of writing together is that it isn't just the right to vote. A democratic infrastructure includes many entry points for people to determine their future. They have to be at the table. They have to be a part of the planning, not just of, how a government supposedly operates, but also how an economy operates. And that's where the democratic infrastructure connects with the economic democracy. But the key to that is information. People have to have a small d democratic media that allows them to have the information so that they can, A, demand a place at the table, and B, come to that table with enough information, background, standing, if you will, so that they can actually have an impact on the process. And I'll close off the thought about it with a comment from the great British parliamentarian Tony Benn. And Tony Benn, who served the better part of 50 years in the British Parliament and always did so as a radical, had a simple set of questions that he said you should always ask when you encounter someone, whether you're encountering a president or the CEO of a corporation, anybody who has power. These are the questions you should ask. What power have you got? i.e., make those people who, run these giant tech companies, who, run countries, who run stock markets, make them explain exactly what power they have. Where did it come from? i.e., does it come from the people? Did they give you that power? Or did you just seize it? Or did you just define it by your own wealth and by the accumulation of additional power through economic means? In whose interest do you use that power? Next question from Ben, i.e., are you serving yourself or are you serving the great mass of people? To whom are you accountable? i.e., are you accountable only to yourself, to your stockholders, to those who make you powerful? Or are your actions, do they have to be responsive to that of the people, the great mass of folks? And finally, how do we get rid of you? And to me, that's the most important question of all, because if you have power that you cannot change, if you can't get rid of it, right? i.e., if you can't say to a monopolistic company, you're too big and too powerful, so we either have to break you up or we have to put what you do into a public sphere so that the people can actually define it democratically. If you can't answer that question, then we should be very, very concerned about you. And so, to my mind, those are the places where the intersections of democratic infrastructure and a democratic economy start to come together.
I love that you're articulating the need to curtail the runaway power of corporate giants, which leads me to the topic of rapidly accelerating computing power, a theme that's central to People Get Ready. John, you propose that there are no new fields coming our way to make up for this massive number of jobs that may be lost to automation. Have you changed your mind in light of the pandemic?
It's a very good question. Look, we wrote this book in a certain moment, obviously trying to anticipate the future. Neither Bob nor I are Nostradamus. We are not seers who see what will come decades or centuries ahead. And so we didn't necessarily anticipate a pandemic. And yet, in many senses, the pandemic drove home so many of the points that we were making. And I think this is a critical thing. From almost the first days of the pandemic, you had people saying, wow, this really, exposes the inequalities, the iniquities of our society. People weren't ready. And as a result, what happened? We know that billionaires became dramatically wealthier. In fact, some billionaires experienced as much as a 70% increase in their wealth. And so at a time when we had a dramatic collapse in employment, at least initially, and all the challenges that extended from that, you had the rich getting incredibly richer. And who got the most richer? Who came out the best? Well, Jeff Bezos at Amazon, he had a fabulous pandemic, right? I mean, maybe I'm not even trying to make judgments about him. He may have felt great pain for people and he may have been very concerned for them, but his economic circumstance became dramatically better. He literally made tens of billions of dollars, so much money that he couldn't even spend it, so much money that he finally decided, I guess I'll take a trip and fly up to outer space, and do a rocket ride. And so our point is that the pandemic shows us in very rapid speed, real time, what happens when there is a radical, dramatic shift in how the economy, the society is organized. We argue in our book that a radical, dramatic shift in how the society and the economy is organized is coming. It's actually already arriving in many senses. And that if we are not ready for that, we run the very real risk of a handful of people getting dramatically richer, a great many people basically being exploited and defined to the sidelines of the process in devastating ways. And a final thing I'll suggest to you is we talk in the book about how traumatic moments will be exploited to accelerate the technological change. Some companies have the ability to make the change, but aren't necessarily making it as rapidly as they might because they fully recognize that society isn't ready for it, that this would be an incredibly, difficult moment. Well, in the pandemic, we saw how rapidly all sorts of new technologies were developed. We're doing this interview via Zoom. I will guarantee you that before the pandemic, there's a really good chance we wouldn't have been. And I wouldn't doubt that you maybe have ordered food on an app, at some point recently. And somebody has come and delivered that food to your door in ways that might never have happened, at least in your lives, before this occurred. So we saw, and we could 100 other playouts of this in so many ways to describe it. We saw in real time the adoption of all sorts of new technologies. What we're arguing is there will be future traumatic moments, future pandemics, future economic downturns, future, inflation moments, whatever that is, where all of this technological change that has already occurred and that is occurring will be rapidly implemented. And at that point, an awful lot of people will have a very small amount of time, a very narrow window in which to decide their future. We want to make sure that when those decisions are made, that the people are at the table and that the democratic infrastructure is sufficient so that the playout of those changes is not devastating for the great mass of people.
Yeah, and jumping off from that, are governments preparing for what's to come? And if not, why not?
They're absolutely not preparing in most cases. There are a few examples of preparation that we can highlight, and I've written a good deal about, and Bob as well, we paid a lot of attention to. Germany actually has been looking at economic change in some very serious ways with major research projects, major examinations of the transformation of work, economy 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. And this is a serious part of their very planned economy. I wouldn't suggest to you for a second that it's a perfect route. And I know that in Germany, there are many people who are very critical of some of the processes and some of the ways that it's going forward. But at least they're having a real discussion about it. And when I do a Zoom like this with members of the German parliament or members of the European Parliament who come from Germany and several other countries, we can have the same discussion we're having. They're well aware of the technological changes and what that may mean for society and what that may mean for the economy. And those debates, while not sufficient, even in Germany, are at least beginning to occur. They are in play. By the same token, in the United States, where I live, it's ridiculous to even suggest that there's a preparation for it. We have, at the end of Barack Obama's presidency, there was some brief exploration of some of these issues and some studies and things. When Trump became president, pretty much all of that disappeared. It stopped. Now, Joe Biden is president. There's a little bit of a renewal of it in some areas, but it's fits and starts. It's not a focused or conscious discussion. And I think that's also very true in the United Kingdom. But what I'll tell you is most countries are not prepared. And this is a critical thing. What Bob and I would suggest is that what's vital is for the people to be prepared, right? For people to start making demands for this technological change, this huge shift that's going to occur, that is occurring, to become a political issue in and of itself. That this is something that candidates for office have to talk about, that parties have to discuss in their platforms, not in a brief couple words about the future of work, but in deep fundamental ways. And that we see the need to link democratic processes with economic change, that we can actually have an influence on it. And at this point, I see, and on the whole planet, I watch this very closely, only a handful of people that even begin to talk in that way as political figures. And so I think there's a tremendous amount of organizing that has to occur. And, Bob and I wrote this book a few years ago. With each passing year, I become more and more concerned because I don't see a sufficient level of organizing and activism. What is encouraging, the last thing I'll say on this, is that Bob and I have worked over the years with a number of unions, and we are seeing some unions, which are powerful forces and which do have a role, beginning to get very serious about it. In the United States, the National Nurses Union is looking at the impact on these technological changes on healthcare, and they are profound. Literally the situation where somebody might not have an actual nurse in their room, but a machine making decisions about, when to get medicine, and they're attached to a machine, and the decisions being there made not by people, but by technology, and all that plays out of that. There are international unions of nurses that are looking at those issues. I also think the transportation unions, Teamsters in the United States and some of the others around the world, are by necessity looking at what is a very real prospect that you will see a dramatic decline in employment for people who drive, because as you move toward driverless vehicles, those jobs just won't be there. So there are unions that I think are highly engaged. I see perhaps the most hope there, but I don't want to give people any kind of false, sense of security here. We do not have a political class or a governing class that is taking these issues as seriously as they should.
Coming back to you, Bob, what happens to these tens of millions of Americans and countless people internationally who won't just be unemployed, but obsolete?
Well, that's not entirely a hypothetical question. We're living through the first stages of that right now. We have been for a while. And preliminary returns are not necessarily good. And it's really the central question we're going to face politically is the answer we get to that question. It's the $64 trillion question, so to speak. Because what's happened in the United States, even before this technology, U.S. capitalism, and I think capitalism in general, has stagnated. It has had crisis after crisis. Right now in the United States, for example, if you take an economics class, you're invariably taught about the genius of the market and how it always works out. And if you work hard, everyone's income will go up if they produce more, and how wonderful the market system is as long as the government stays out of the way and doesn't interfere. You'd probably be confused by the fact that our capitalist system has been in such crisis that now it's routinely the government's doing $4, $5, $6 trillion of bailouts to keep the damn thing afloat. And that's before we get to the next wave of technological change. We've already got a generation of men in particular, but people overall, who've been sort of written out of the economy, and their incomes have gone down dramatically in the United States. The labor participation rate, which is people actively looking for jobs or having jobs, among working age Americans, 25 to 54, has plummeted in the last 20 years. And as observers point out, these aren't all people in the leisure class who are just flying up to outer space and doing lines of cocaine with celebrities. These are working class people who can't find jobs, and they've given up. And they're just doing whatever you do when you're broke and you give up. And so what we're going to face now, as this becomes more of an issue in the United States and worldwide, is a fork in the road. I mean, in vulgar materialism, the way it always worked, and in some Marxist theory, the masses would be poor, they'd be exploited, and they'd recognize their oppression, they'd rise up and change the system, and we'd live happily ever after. Well, it hasn't worked that way, and it doesn't always work that way. Some people will respond that way. Hopefully, a lot of people will respond in a sort of optimistic way. We can make things better. We can actually improve our situation. But there are also going to be a lot of people, and we see it right now in the United States, who basically they're resigned to the status quo. They don't think it's possible to change anything. They've been taught that you can't do it, and they've accepted that. But they're frustrated as hell with why their life is deteriorating, and that becomes the sewage out of which fascist movements, racist movements, hate movements, authoritarian movements grow and prosper. And so we have the great battle then among the dispossessed and those less possessed than there were, if not dispossessed, sort of dealing with the great change taking place and how they respond. And the outcome of that struggle between those wanting to create a more egalitarian, democratic, open society and those wanting to just keep the status quo, but beat the crap out of people who are not in the dominant race or whatever religion. That's the great fight we face whenever capitalism's in crisis, between democracy on one hand and fascism on the other hand. And that's the fight we're facing today, to put it in stark terms. So I think that's the context to understand what's going on. And I mean, the point is, it's no guarantee people will go one way or the other. That's really a political struggle that's going to determine the outcome of that fight. The same person who might say, well, that person's a racist, that person's awful, that person won't. Some of those people who do that are only doing that because they think there's no other choice. They've got to blame someone. That's the only person around they can see the blame. Some of them will go that way no matter what. But there are a lot of people, if they actually say, hey, if we get together and organize together, we can create a world where no one's hungry. We can create a world where our kids get medical attention. We can create a world in which, we live in cities that are great to live in and we can get around easily and see our friends. We can have a great life. And so that's what the struggle is really about right now, is seeing that the dispossessed and the less possessed in the coming years can see that there is hope for a better future if they organize. And if they organize, they will win. And the way they'll win is the people who oppose democratic movements and popular movements. They know that it's in their DNA, it's in their bone marrow. They instantly always try to crush any effort to organize because they know that's the end of them if that ever gets off the ground.
It's so good to hear informed optimism. Bob, let's shift gears a bit. There's an absolutely wild graph in the book that represents theoretical growth in computing power. So from about the 1980s to 2014, the graph is more or less flat. And then around 2015, it goes shooting straight up. Why is accelerating computing power in the hands of the 0.1% such an alarming prospect?
Well, what you're referring to is what's called Moore's Law, which was developed in the 1960s. It basically said the power of computing doubles for each dollar spent every year and a half. And it seems fairly innocent the first few decade or so that it doubles every year and a half. But then you get sort of deep into that process by the 1990s or 2000s. And when you double every 2 years or a year and a half, your double power, it's a massive number. This is what you're referring to. And that's the period we're in now. There's some debate whether Moore's Law is slowing down, but it's almost, even the people who make that argument say it's really sort of irrelevant debate because there are other changes in computing taking place, like quantum computing that's coming along, that it's going to blow all this out of the water as it develops. And that's not hypothetical. That's in the pipeline. So the fact is the principle of Moore's Law, the principle of that chart is going to continue. And we're at the point now where it doesn't have to continue much. We're already so far gone. The computer power is so strong it can accommodate just about anything, and it will get stronger. And this circles back to the basic political issues that we wrote the book about that we've been talking about, which is that this Cambrian revolution, so to speak, in computer power and technology is happening, and we have to make sure we control how it goes. We can't just sit back and let it happen. It's not going to be something like no humans having to do with it. It will be shaped entirely by humans. It's just which humans. How are they values are they going to follow? Who are they answering to? And right now, if we don't change some things and get our society much more democratic, decisions are being made by powerful corporate CEOs. They're being made by scientists who are embedded in the system. They're being made by top government bureaucrats and officials around the world who basically live in the same community where they go from Google to some government body to an advisory body to the UN to Facebook. and they all hang out at the same Davos sort of club. Their kids go to the same private schools. They live in a gated universe where the great bulk of the people really are just people that are there. You just basically want to keep them in their place and not let them get in your way. They're there to serve you.
Thanks, Bob. Not to share a spoiler, but towards the end of the book, you refer to universal basic income as a phony solution.
Well, that's one of our favorite subjects to go after. A universal basic income, just for people who are not familiar with it, it's a program that was first proposed almost a century ago. And since the computer age, it's increased in popularity. It had a burst of support in the 60s, and now it's returned again recently, most famously in the United States by a presidential candidate named Andrew Yang, who said that he ran his whole presidential campaign for the Democratic nomination in 2020 on the idea of instituting a universal basic income where every American would be given $1,000 a month to do with as they please. And it sounds like a great idea. The economy produces more and more, but it needs less and less workers. So this is a way everyone in society can benefit from the bounty being produced and participate. You can get rid of deep poverty and despair. And that's how Andrew Yang presented it. And he said he talked to his friends at Google and Yahoo, and they all thought it was a pretty good idea. We'll cut that check for keep everyone, give them their $1,000. They sit in their couch and get loaded and just stay out of our way. And they can use their $1,000 to buy products. We'll sell them. We'll get the money right back. Man, that's not a bad system. And I guess if you're living in dire poverty, you can't find a job, you're starving, your kids don't have clothes, that's better than nothing. I mean, I guess if that's your two choices in the world are universal basic income or nothing, you take universal basic income. But it's basically a bribe. And, the main proponents of this historically have been conservatives in the United States. Milton Friedman was a champion of universal basic income because what they liked about it was you pay people off, you buy them off, you give them an amount of money, and it's never going to be too much because they aren't going to have any political power, but just enough so they don't die. Keep them alive, just so they can pay their rent. You give people enough money to do that. And then basically you don't change anything in society. The structure remains identical. They have to pay for everything out of their universal basic income. And so it's really the cheapest possible way to maintain a class structure without having to change anything and keeping people from on their couches. So that sounds to us like hell, not heaven. That sounds to us like an incredibly awful society, a dystopian world in which we change nothing. A handful of really wealthy and powerful people own the world and operate it, and the rest of us are paid off to stay in our couch and get out of their way and not make trouble. If we do make trouble, we'll get thrown into jail. I think the solution is pretty clear, and John has referred to it. We write about it in the book, which is instead of giving people a check and cashing them out and say, this is your money, now get out of the way. Instead, we try to do the exact opposite. We try to bring them into the society and controlling, managing partners with everyone else. So what we should do is do what Franklin Roosevelt suggested. What we should do is create the second Bill of Rights, guarantee everyone for free education, healthcare, housing, recreation, employment that they want, if they want it. Guarantee those things as public goods they get access to for free, and then really raise the whole floor for everyone to be an equal citizen in society, regardless of their parent station. And then if you want to layer in some universal basic income on top of that to pay for knickknacks or something, or fine, I've got no problem with that. But I don't think you give a universal basic income and say, okay, good luck getting your health care out of your $1,000 and paying for childcare and paying your tuition. It doesn't work. And if you think you're going to get the universal basic income up to a real living wage, well, you know nothing about how politics works. If you can get that, then you might as well get all these other things like healthcare, housing, recreation, things that really matter that will last forever.
Bob, it sounds like you're just getting started. You don't pull your punches when you write that capitalism is the wrong economic system for these times. We have to ask, is moving beyond capitalism a pipe dream? It feels a bit David and Goliath, don't you think?
Well, let's hope it's not a pipe dream. I think part of the problem we have, and we all do, is that some form of socialism is the alternative to capitalism. That's sort of, there's really no one suggesting we go back to a feudal economy and have lords and dukes and things like that, and we all become serfs. So some form of socialism is the next stage beyond the capitalism. And that's a very interesting conversation. What does that mean? And capitalism itself, could it go on forever and ever? Well, I think right now you can make a pretty strong argument that in its history, capitalism has had some things it's been really good at doing. It's been really good at industrializing. It's been really good at expanding the GNP or GDP of countries, of creating more wealth. It's been really good at fundamentally revolutionizing societies and turning them upside down and inside out in a very short period of time. So capitalism has done those things, but it's also always had great problems associated with it. Inequality that doesn't go away, rampant materialism, environmental degradation built right into the system because it's profitable. The goal is to make as much money as possible, and you're punished by being made poor if you don't do that, and your competitors do. So capitalism has these deep problems, and capitalism's also had a really hostile relationship with political democracy. Democracy has not been something that capitalism's entirely comfortable with, because capitalism is a system based on where a small number of people have most of the wealth, and the vast majority of people have most of the votes, and it doesn't always mix well. So can we get past that? Well, we have to. We have to get past capitalism. We don't have a choice. So then the question is, what are we going to have after? And I think that's something we'll determine. I don't think you have a game plan ahead of time or a blueprint, say this is what it's going to be like, sign here and we'll get it. I think it'll be through practice, and I think it'll probably be gradual. It'll be sort of like, imagine the situation that we've talked about with that second Bill of Rights, that democratic infrastructure. If we put those guarantees in the society, and some European countries have most of those things guaranteed already. My wife's Norwegian, healthcare, education, childcare, pretty much covered. If you're the poorest person in Norway, you get the same coverage more or less as the wealthiest person in Norway. So if we have installed all those sort of mechanisms now, guaranteed employment, then, it looks a little different. Some sectors of the economy can probably be converted to taken out of the hands of capitalists and corporations. And I think the place to start is the place that's getting a lot of attention now, these internet companies, any monopoly, Google, Facebook, these guys that make their money basically by having monopolies and then paying off the politicians so they can keep their monopolies. These guys are parasites. In the United States, we have these companies called internet service providers. They're nothing but organized crime syndicates, AT&T, Verizon. They do nothing of value. They get their monopoly rights by getting monopoly licenses from the government, and they have all their regulators go work for them as their lobbyists once they leave government. It's a complete scam. Those sort of things have to go. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily in the economy, of course, there won't be a room for private enterprise. Someone wants to start a restaurant or business, but there will be limits on how much power a private owner can have. It can't threaten the power of the political democracy. It's not going to work out necessarily that easily, but I think it's a solvable problem. I think we actually started to make a lot of headway there in the world in the 20th century. And we could have gone in a very different direction than we did. Had Roosevelt, that pattern survived in the United States, that would have been a powerful message to the rest of the world in the 20th century. And we lost that moment. But it's doable. I think it's definitely doable, and we don't have to do it all in one fell swoop. It's not like you push a button and everything changes. It's going to be a process, and you start with the stuff that's most important and most immediate, and you do that. I'll add one thing that we haven't talked about that is looming on the horizon that is one of the reasons we need to change our system so badly, and one of the reasons this technology is even more disconcerting, which is the threat of war and violence. One of the reasons fascism is such a problem, why these fascist movements are such a problem, and this was something that observers noted in the 1930s, people who studied Mussolini and Hitler, is that they use extensive government money to bankroll, to pay people off and cronyism, but they don't want to do social programs that actually benefit people. So they put all the money into security, police, military, and so war becomes inevitable, especially when you combine it with an ideology based on national and racial superiority. War violence is inevitable with fascism and their whole political economy. And that's got to be an issue, because that is not something, again, we barely survived the last round with fascism in the 1930s and 40s. And we're just lucky there weren't some Werner von Braun didn't get there before our scientists did in the Manhattan Project. We've had a Cambrian revolution in militarism since then. I don't think we can roll the dice on another round of fascism in major countries and think we're going to survive. And so that I think we better get to work.
Well, let's pass the mic to John. If we survive war and fascism, what kind of transition beyond capitalism might we see? Would you put on your beyond capitalism glasses and tell us what the future of work looks like to you?
Sure. Let me adjust my glasses and say that part of the reason that Bob and I wrote this book was to avoid the war and the fascism. And so hopefully this transition doesn't have to be that violent and rude awakening that so often has been attendant to societal change and economic change throughout history. We think that it is possible, if people do get ready, if they are aware of what's coming, if they make demands, to have a peaceful transition. And that's what we want. But when you ask this question about what the future of work will be, I think the honest answer is we don't know. And that's a really important admission to make up front. When people tell you, oh yeah, it's going to work this way, it's going to look like this, you kind of lock yourself into a path and you say, well, this is the way we're headed. And we know we're here now and we're going to get to that point. And society itself starts to try and bend itself toward those goals of maybe achieving a certain type of transportation, maybe achieving a certain type of organization of housing, things like that. And the truth of the matter is that planning is important, but planning has to be based on a democratic process that people are a part of. And so what concerns Bob and I is that the people be a part of this, right? That the people be there defining what the future of work is and what it looks like. So I know that sounds like an avoidance of your question. So let me go deeper into it and offer a few thoughts. And one of the things, my favorite chapter, my favorite section of the book is where we write about the Luddites. And these were the people in the early 19th century in the United Kingdom who were agrarian or rural workers, often in the textile industries. And you start to see industrialization, manufacturing come. And they were forced to, leave their traditional lives and become part of a factory culture, what, was referred to by Blake as the dark satanic mills. And so they resisted that. They broke machines. They literally fought against technological progress. They, wrestled with it. And many people thought, well, they're just, foolish. They're against the future. They don't recognize, what's going on, or they're even stupid. That wasn't the case at all. The Luddites were incredibly, if you read their writings, they were incredibly thoughtful, incredibly engaged people, very serious about what was going on because they saw what was happening to them. And they didn't just worry about moving from this kind of work to another kind of work. They worried about the society that would come to be if they all ended up working in factories, not just on their own, but with their children as well. Because remember, moving into the factories, you start to see a lot of child labor, things of that nature. So the Luddites resisted, and they failed miserably. But to Bob's point about militarism, the British government at the time of industrialization in the north of England had more troops at times in the north of England than it did in places in its colonies, right? Britain was all over the world trying to colonize other places, and yet they were most concerned about their own people saying, we don't want to have this change in our work. We don't want to go this way, to have our society be defined by the owners of these mills. We want to have a much more small-d democratic role here. They were put down, the Luddite revolt was, but the Luddites kept meeting. There's wonderful stories of how decades after they failed in their rebellion, they would meet at night on moonlit nights in rural areas. And they would wait till the night of the fullest moon so they could find their way to the meeting spot and find their way home. Remember, this is still in the early to mid 19th century. And they would talk about not their work, but about society and democracy. And the Luddites gave rise to the Chartists, and the Chartists gave rise to the trade union movement. Trade union movement gave rise to the Labor Party in its best manifestations in the mid 20th century. And you moved from a point where people were feeling completely disempowered to a point where you enacted 8-hour workday, you ended child labor, you created protections for women and people of color and others in the workplace and in society itself. You had radical transformation of society, not the solving of all of society's problems, but changes that probably the Luddites couldn't even have imagined, and yet they started. And so what I would argue is that today we have to understand that it is important to resist changes that we don't have a role in. We don't have to necessarily go break the machines. In fact, I think we love our cell phones so much, we would never do that. But we do have to recognize that as these changes come, we've got to be a part of this discussion about what it's going to look like. And we have to be a part of defining what the future of work is. We can't let it be defined by others. And the fact of the matter is, if I, now putting on the dangerous hat of making a prediction, I think we will work less if we succeed. If we, the people, are a part of defining this future, we will work a lot less. Maybe we will barely work. Because what we know is that there's an immense amount of wealth, right? All of this technological change is making billionaires soon into trillionaires. So we're creating an immense amount of wealth. Maybe we, the people, don't have to work quite as hard as we imagine. And if the process is democratized, instead of us being exploited and working 3 or 4 jobs to try and just get by, we can have a situation with a fair and equitable organization of society where we don't have to work very much, or where the work that we do is far more creative. Remember, technological change is supposed to end drudgery. It's supposed to free us from having to do the least attractive jobs. And so, we shouldn't resist machinery that will clean our streets for us or that will clean our homes for us. That's fine. That's great. Why would we want to have a situation where people are paid very, very little to do very, very unpleasant jobs? So let us imagine that in the future, we all get to be rich people, right? And so we get to choose the kind of work that we do, i.e., we want to do creative work. We want to do rewarding work. We want to do things that make our lives and the lives of those around us better. And there should be a lot more of that. That ought to be the goal we get to. And so when we talk about how to define it, right, and how to imagine it, this is the last thing I'll say on this. In the book, we give a bow to utopian fiction. And we say, this is a really valuable thing. You need to have people imagining the future and telling you what it's going to look like, not because it's that this is the locked-in way that it's going to be, but that this is a possibility of a way that it might be. You might reject that utopian fiction. You might say, I don't want that future. Give me another book. I want to read about something else. I want to read about an alternative future. But it's interesting that William Morris in News from Nowhere, Edward Bellamy in Looking Backward, W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Princess, and a number of incredible books. He actually, Du Bois wrote an immense amount of utopian and speculative fiction. What these writers did in the late 19th and early 20th century was to give us a way to imagine the future in which, frankly, we don't work as much and our lives are better. And that's what we ought to really focus in on, is thinking about a future where the changes that have taken place redound to our benefit. They don't make billionaires and trillionaires better off. They make us better off. And so we work less. There is less drudgery. Our lives are more rewarding. And that ought to be our goal. That's what we ought to be working toward. We do not have to define whether we work 2 hours a day or 4 hours a day. We don't have to define whether we work on poetry or art. But what we do have to define is that in that future, we, the people, will be maximizing the choices and maximizing the opportunities for the great mass of human beings, rather than simply having a future that is owned, defined, and shaped by a handful of trillionaires who exploit us at every turn and who will make us work harder and harder for less and less. Our goal should be to work less and less for more and more.
I love that, John. And I personally think there's a lot to be said for making more time in our lives for work that's really meaningful. Say, growing food, cooking, even cleaning together in community. And it leads us into a topic that I think is really important: personal and spiritual development. Here's another easy one for you, John. You quote Pope Francis in the intro to the book. He said, "Our immense technological development has not been accompanied by development in human responsibility, values, and conscience." What's the connection between values, responsibility, and conscience, and the type of systemic change that's needed today?
That is a very good question, and it goes to the heart of the matter. I'm glad you quoted the Pope. The Pope is actually, a while ago I was asked how governments are doing on sorting through a lot of this. And my answer, of course, was that they're doing a lousy job by and large. The interesting thing is that the Pope has actually been pretty serious about this. In his encyclicals and in many of his statements, he's talked a lot about the future of work and the future of the economy and how it might be organized, also with a very strong environmental overlay. Now it happens, I'm not Catholic, so I'm looking at the Pope as a thinker, and he's doing a lot of what Bob and I suggest that everybody should be doing, and that is imagining the future as a place where our values and our ideals can be definitional. And how do we get to that? How do we get to the point where, first off, we're welcomed to consider the future? Now, the Pope is in an easy situation because it's expected of him, right? All the cardinals make you the Pope, and then you're supposed to issue encyclicals and come up with great ideas and see the future and et cetera, et cetera. We have other people in society that are put in such a position, sometimes presidents and prime ministers, but by and large, we have ceded a lot of the freedom, if you will, to think about the future to a handful of elites. The genesis of this book that Bob and I did was actually looking at what happens at Davos in Switzerland, where the wealthiest people in the world come together once a year at a ski resort, and they think about the future, right? And they think about, how they're going to organize the world. And actually, there's a lot of conferences like this. They have them in Aspen in the United States. They have them, in places all over the world, and they're really nice. I just want to emphasize, I've actually, in writing this book and other things, I've gone to a couple of these. And, it's mineral water all around and, limousines and people, taking care. It's very well stocked refrigerators, et cetera, the whole bit. And those who are in those situations, as they imagine the future, sometimes they get, pretty creative with it. They're relatively liberal in their imagining that it might be a good future for a lot of people. But the interesting dynamic is that they basically imagine that at core, the future will be really, really good for them, right? That if they're rich, they're going to be richer. If their lives are good, their lives are going to be better. And if there's a problem that might make them less rich, less happy, they want to remove that problem. They want to get rid of it. They want to deal with it. And that's fine. That's who they are. Okay. But I would like the great mass of people to be in that situation where when they look at the future, they say, well, what would be good for me? What would be good for my community, for my state, my region? Is it a jobless future with very little democracy where we are all sort of struggling to get by, literally in a mass precarity where, most of us don't have options or opportunities? Or might it be better if we all have an immense amount of small d democratic control over our governance and over our economy, i.e., we're at the table making decisions based on our values and on our needs? I think Bob and I are both confident that a great mass of informed people, and this is an important part of it, Bob and I write mostly about media, that people who are informed about what the issues are and informed about what the options are, a great mass of informed and engaged people will in fact make decisions that will be better for the great mass of informed people than for the very, very wealthy folks who might gather at Davos and Aspen. If they're parallel, great. If everybody comes to the same place, fine. But if the people decide on a different course than the masters of the universe at Davos, well, then we're on the side of democracy. We believe the people ought to be able to make that call. And they ought to be able to make the call for a future where the great wealth, the great progress that comes from technological change is distributed in a fair and equitable way, and that the great mass of people have better lives, less drudgery, more realization of their hopes and dreams. And so, I want values to be central to this discussion. I want values to, drive us. I want us all to take the time that the Pope was able to take and think about our future. And then I want us all to be able to act on it in deep and fundamental ways. Now, for that to happen, nobody's going to give us that. That's not going to be a gift that, the elites decide, oh, well, let's bring the people into this process. That is something we're going to have to demand through our unions, through our politics, through our organizing. And if as human beings we make that demand, even if we don't succeed in getting everything that we want, even if we don't have the fullest possible democracy, the fact that we are making demands about the organization of the future will make that future better for the great mass of humanity. Simply making the demand, being out there saying, we know what you're doing in our name, but without our informed consent, we demand that we be a part of this process. If we do that, I guarantee you we will shape a much better future than what we're going to get if we let the people at Davos decide it.
Agreed. We're going to queue up this next question with an eloquent voice of the people. It's a portion of a speech that you quote in your book.
Through our scientific and technological genius, we have made of this world a neighborhood. And now, through our moral and ethical commitment, we must make of it a brotherhood. We must all learn to live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools. This is what we must see now.
Of course, that was Dr. Martin Luther King from 1965. Let's talk about coming together as it relates to activism. Bob, you propose that any sort of activism is limited by the existing economic system. Democracy, biodiversity loss, public transportation, any agenda is limited by the push for corporate profit. What are some core issues that all activists could make part of their mission? And why is it vital to act in unison?
Well, first of all, let's just talk about that Martin Luther King quote that you played that was so wonderful. If you think about it, it's pretty amazing. I think, John, correct me if I'm wrong, John will know the answer to this. He's the only person in the 20th century we've given a national holiday to.
Yeah.
The United States, yeah.
I believe so.
The only one since Lincoln, to my knowledge.
Yeah. And we had to fight for it.
Boy, did we ever. I mean, you listen to that, and that guy'd be lucky to get a job in an American university probably today if he wasn't careful. He didn't frame it in some sort of rhetoric that no one understands. Yeah, I mean, it's a high point. We talk about this in the book, that the activism of the 60s, the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s created a space where a person like Martin Luther King could say stuff like that and be taken really seriously by lots of people. It was a very dynamic political environment. It's a political environment where, going back to the Franklin Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights, where basically we came this close to getting that happen legislatively or in the courts by the end of the 60s, early 70s. And then things sort of shifted in the wrong direction. And now we seem to be like a million miles away from Martin Luther King and his values and what he was talking about. But what he says is absolutely, and what you're asking about is absolutely the right question. I mean, how do we get it so people working on the one things they care about and that they see in their lives they want to deal with, those things, how do we get them to work with all those people working on related issues so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, so that we actually be successful? And I think that's actually a solvable problem, fortunately. I think it's a problem that, because of the weakness in the United States and perhaps elsewhere, progressive and popular forces, it seems much bigger. The problem is, like, all these other people worked on my issue, I'd be successful. And I think that, I'd say there's two problems there. First of all, and this is something that will surprise people, in the United States, there are a lot more people sympathetic to popular progressive politics than is generally understood. And if you were in this country during the pandemic in the summer of 2020, I think it was nothing short of astounding to see the demonstrations over George Floyd's murder. And when I'm talking about astounding, I mean, even people, my most crazy optimistic friends, were blown away. I mean, I've never seen anything quite like this in terms of the quantity of people who came out to protest and demonstrate, the diversity of people that came out to demonstrate. I'll give one short example. John, I'm sure, could talk at length about this. I was going up to visit some friends with my wife in rural Wisconsin, and we had to drive through this small town, all white town, and there were like 75 people out demonstrating about George Floyd. This would have never happened 20 years ago, ever, not possible, or 30 years ago. I mean, even in the 60s and 70s, you went into a white neighborhood and you're protesting for civil rights, more likely to get stoned than to be applauded. This is a fundamental change. So, I mean, there's grounds for optimism there that hasn't been there. And I think the other thing that I would say is that what happens is when people come together to work on campaigns that unify all these issues, aren't just single issues, so that you're working for a political candidate or a movement that is working not just on the climate, not just on inequality, not just on human rights, but so these are all important, they all rise and fall together, then the dynamism grows exponentially. You see a qualitative leap in sort of the morale, the momentum. And when you're involved, like in those George Floyd protests, or I've been involved in political campaigns, progressive campaigns that have drawn a lot of people together who normally aren't in the same room. The vibe in the room, the vibe among the people it can't be described. It's just wonderful. It's beautiful. And it's something that when you feel it, you feel like you can't ever lose. And that vibe has to come back. Once people work together, see common ground, and work together on issues and respect each other, anything's possible. And again, to go back to a point I've made before, this is why people in power do everything they can prevent that from ever happening. Their number one job is to not let people get together, talk to each other, come together, understand, and work together. That's the number one thing they want to prevent from taking place. And, one of the things that takes place in the United States, for example, and I think also in other countries, is that, if you're an academic, like I've been most of my life, there are all sorts of inane academic debates and seminars and stuff that seem like people are fighting over the most important issues in the world. And they hate each other and they won't talk to each other the next day. And, all the sort of silliness goes on. But then the same people, if you get in a campaign room and you realize you agree on most stuff, can be best friends. So, I mean, it's just the context you're in, whether issues are going to divide us or bring us together. The thing I think about King's comment that is so important, and is the hardest one, is the last point. And you're really going to come together and act like brothers and sisters, or we're going to die together as fools. And that's something that it's painful for people to think that. Sometimes they say, I don't want to have to give up what I actually believe in to work with someone else, and I don't think someone should have to. But there's so much anger. And sometimes the only people that will listen to you are other people who have similar grievances, so you just yell at each other, because the people actually have power couldn't care less what you're saying. And say, yeah, go ahead and beat each other up in the seminar room. So getting people working together on actual things is crucial. And finally, I'm an optimist, as is John. I've always been an optimist. I genuinely believe we can win these things, although I'm not an idiot. I'm not a fool. I think the stakes are much higher now than they've ever been in our lifetime. And I think anyone who doesn't realize that is dreaming. And so, I mean, I'm always guided by the fact that a quote from someone I like to quote who deserves his own national holiday, Noam Chomsky. And what Chomsky likes to say is that, ultimately it comes down to everyone's got to look in the mirror and make a decision. You can act like social change for the better is impossible, or you can act like social change for the better is possible and lead your life that way. And if you do the latter, it's possible you'll contribute to it, but there's no guarantee it will happen. But if you act like social change for the better is impossible, you're doing your part to make sure that it never will take place, that we'll never have social change for the better. And that's the one thing you control as an individual. That's the one thing when you look in the mirror you can answer for. And I think that's what everyone has to do. And I think when enough people do that and come together, we're unstoppable, and the history will support that. So I'm optimistic that we can do it, that we can come together. And I think that once there's dynamism, once movements actually win victories, once they actually accomplish stuff, and build momentum, a lot of this petty stuff that divides people and gets them name calling and yelling at each other and pointing fingers just disappears as silly and a waste of time. And I think that's what will happen again.
So just an add-on then, are there particular issues that you believe can unify people to move in the direction of structural change, whether we're talking about democracy or economics?
Yeah, I do. I think most of these issues you start with the idea of, in the United States, the right to quality health care, the right to housing, the right to education, to live in an environment that supports life and will continue to support life. These are all things that we all share, that everyone experiences. Childcare. So in America today, it's really hard to raise children unless you're rich. I mean, it costs so much. There's so much out-of-pocket expenses. So, it's sort of a fundamental human right, the right to reproduce, is becoming a leisure class activity increasingly in the United States because you can't afford childcare, you can't afford the stuff that goes with raising kids anymore. Those things should all be free like they are in Scandinavia, but they aren't here. So I think you can unite on those issues too. And I think there might be some people who say, no, I hate that idea. We shouldn't have any more children. We should grind people for all those things. But I don't think that's a mass movement on that side. I do think it's a mass movement on our side.
Great. Thanks. We're coming to the end of our conversation, and we want to focus on the people of People Get Ready. John, what do you think needs to be addressed to prepare us to become citizens of a functioning democracy?
I think that the best way to prepare to be citizens of a functioning democracy is to recognize that in a democracy, whether it be a democracy in name only, or whether it be a fully realized democracy, there are pivotal moments. What Bob often talks about is critical junctures. Those are points at which we're going to make big choices. And we have to recognize, first and foremost, that we're coming to such a point. We have to know what's at stake. And we have to be prepared to respond to it in big ways. And that is to say that apart from the technological change that's coming, we have to recognize that we won't be able to handle that technological change. We won't be able to handle all that's coming at us unless we make changes in our democratic infrastructure and changes in our economy so that we, the people, are much more empowered. And this is a big deal because, it's one thing to say, oh, yeah, I know what's at stake. I know what matters. I know what's a big deal. And to actually feel it, to know that this is the moment, that you are living in a historical, again, critical juncture where we're either going to get it right or get it wrong. And one of the best ways to understand that is to go back to something we write about in the book, which is the end of World War II, the point at which we were coming out of first off, a Great Depression, which was very transformative and forced a lot of change, and then a war, which was a global fight between fascism and, at its best, democracy. And the forces of light, the good guys, were going to win that war. At a certain point in 1944, it became increasingly clear that fascism would be defeated in its, at least the expression that we were looking at. And so then the question was, well, how do we come out of this? What do we do next? We've harnessed all this energy to defeat this foe. Could we possibly harness this energy to shape a better future? And that's what Roosevelt was talking about with the Economic Bill of Rights. And the unfortunate reality is that in the United States, my country, the choice was made not to meet the future, not to go for it. People instead chose what was sometimes referred to as normalcy, right? They went back to what they knew. They desperately wanted to just kind of ease off, not feel as much stress. And I understand that. I totally respect it. But the end result is that the United States, instead of coming out of a fight against fascism and realizing that we had a fundamental duty to immediately address segregation, Jim Crow segregation, lynchings, the brutal discrimination against Black people and people of color in places across this country. And we need to do that immediately, right? Because that was separating people based on color of their skin, their ethnicity, their religion, and saying, well, you are less, right, because of this. That's what we just fought against when we fought against fascism. We should have come home and said, well, we got to deal with this here. The same with sexism and discrimination against women. I mean, that should have happened immediately after World War II. It, of course, should have happened a long time before. But at that critical juncture, we should have acted, and we didn't. Now, we had a lot of democracy in America. Well, we're in a perfect democracy, but we had a lot of freedom to make our choices. And the choices that we made, defined very much by powerful individuals who said, well, this is what we should do. These are the options we should have. They narrowed, and we ended up, wasting a huge part of the next several decades on a Cold War and on, all sorts of really kind of misguided steps. And it harmed our country. We didn't do what we could have done. And a lot of people came out worse as a result of that. Our economy did quite well, but as a society, we had, many things that went unaddressed. So we have to recognize that can happen, right? We can make the wrong choice. And so we ought to be looking now at how do we make sure that we make the right choice as we, face all of this change. What do we want to do? But one of the things Bob and I have argued for a very long time is that it's important that people know what's coming at them. And so it's very, very vital that we recognize the crisis of our media. Our media doesn't give people enough information about how to define their own lives. Our media is too often, driven by a couple of talking heads, maybe one on the left, one on the right, saying, well, this is what the debate is about today, rather than a much deeper discourse about real people's lives, what they face, what the challenges coming at them are, and how they can get engaged with them. So we don't need to save our media. A lot of people say today, there's a lot of, loss of journalism jobs and that. And they say, we got to save the media. No, we don't need to save it. We need to change it. We need a fundamentally different, small d democratic media that gives us a great deal more information about the real issues that we face in our lives. Much better perspective on what's going on. That's, step one. Step two, we need to recognize that we, the people, have the power to make things issues. We ought to make this technological change an issue. We shouldn't accept folks in power saying, no, this is just, it's commercial progress. This is just how, we're going to get you an iPhone 15 or an iPhone 16. And, that's what all this technological change is about. It's just this, kind of incremental next step along the way. You don't really need to pay attention. Just get your, checkbook ready, get your credit card ready, because we're going to give you something new to sell. Instead of accepting it as that, we need to understand we're going through something that is fundamentally changing our politics, our economy, our society, our lives, how we communicate, how our children communicate with us. I mean, who hasn't had a situation where they're concerned about their kid and a phone, right? Too much time on the phone. So we need to know that we can make this an issue, and then frankly, we need to make it an issue. And finally, we need to give what we want a label. We need to give it a name. We don't have that right now, and it's a really serious issue. We know that all this change is coming. We know that there's a fundamentally different society taking shape. We know that capitalism has its choice, right? That elite capitalism knows what it wants out of this, and that's for the very, very wealthy to become a whole lot richer and to exploit this situation to their benefit. We need to be much more comfortable with giving a name to what we favor. And it may be democratic socialism, maybe communitarianism or some other term. It may be tech utopia. You can pick your name if you want. But the fact of the matter is that we have to name our hopes and our dreams. We have to give it some sort of definition. Because if we do, then we know what we're fighting for and what we're demanding. And it ought to be simple. I mean, I like the term democratic socialism. It doesn't bother me at all. In fact, I think that we've seen in America an awful lot of people with Bernie Sanders' campaigns are far more inclined to be open to this. But whatever name we give our goal, we have to have it, and we have to have it as sort of a shared understanding of this is what we're fighting for. And we also have to understand that it's something different than capitalism. It's something different than the capitalism that we have today. And if we don't accept that, if we don't recognize that, then we run the very real risk of having a conversation in which we know what we want, but we can't quite describe it. And we know what we're fighting for, but we can't quite, reduce it down to this simple set of messages that we can win with. And the fact is that we need to win. I mean, I don't want to, be too dystopian here, but I have to tell you that when Bob and I wrote this book, we would call each other on the phone and we'd keep going back and forth about, some new study we'd read or some new piece of information we found. And it was just jarring. And we were thinking, if we don't intervene on behalf of humanity, we are going to end up with a future that we absolutely don't want. And as Bob said a little while ago, that even the very wealthy aren't going to want. In fact, we have a duty, we the people have a duty to save the elites from the future they would give us. We're obviously going to save ourselves as well. But the end result is that if you want a future that is economically, socially, racially just, that is humane, that saves the planet, we have to understand what we're fighting for. We have to know what's at stake, and we have to be clear that, we're not arguing about some minutia here. This isn't a little thing. We're not arguing about whether we like our iPhone or we don't. What we're arguing about is whether we can organize a society in which we are no longer exploited, but where we, the people, make the decisions about how we work and how we live.
Wow, nice. What a way to wrap up episode 1. I think we can safely say this has been the perfect way to kick off 2 Minutes to Midnight. Bob and John, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for People Get Ready, and thank you for being with us on our premiere episode.
Well, thank you all. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. You really honor us with your so much with your interest and the quality of your questions. It's what any author would dream of. So we appreciate it very much.
Yeah, I agree. Hear, hear.
Thank you all so much for joining us for 2 Minutes to Midnight, People Get Ready. And a huge thanks to our guests, Robert McChesney and John Nichols. We really appreciate everyone who subscribes to Catalista on Patreon, where contributors can access merch and bonus interviews. 2 Minutes to Midnight, People Get Ready is proud to partner with Local Futures, a non-profit organization that's a pioneer in the worldwide localization movement. Visit them at localfutures.org. You can find the current schedule of Catalista podcasts and sign up for our weekly email at catalista.net. If you enjoyed 2 Minutes to Midnight, please add, comment, and like us on your favorite podcast platform. 2M2M was edited and mixed by Ben Sorokis. Sound design is by Darren Chorley. Our music is composed by John Askew. The executive producers are Chicky Munch and Binny Bunny Munch, with assistance from Ed Goldberg and Gerald Gerbil. This is Henry Coleman, signing off from the studios at Catalista Centrale. See you all next time.